I wasn't here with you last week when Bruce preached, but I was delighted that he spoke about preaching from the lectionary, because it's also been my experience that there is something that God really plants in my mind and heart that I end up bringing in the summer service, and inevitably I've had to go searching for the scriptures that went along with it, and this year it was right there in the lectionary. So this is hard stuff. If you pay attention to the news these days, it can seem as though Solomon was entirely right in despairing of the futility of human existence. The news is equally grim everywhere you look, whether here in the States, 2 new mass shootings just last night, or more broadly across North America, in the UK and the EU, Africa, Asia, the Pacific, South America. Even the Arctic and Antarctica are increasingly sources of deeply demoralizing news. Not the fake kind either. There is a vast profusion of heartbreakingly real, bad news the world over, most of it self-inflicted, human beings actively manufacturing misery. Collectively, we seem incapable of bringing anything like wisdom to bear. Rather, the more bad news we encounter, in some perverse way, we seem more committed to blaming someone else, or like Solomon, as you heard just a moment ago, simply surrendering to despondency, cynicism, and defeat. As one small example, a Guardian columnist recently wrote, "The world is literally on fire. But despite the climate emergency, capitalism continues regardless." Or in Solomon's words, folly and vanity. Perhaps more viscerally distressing, another columnist wrote, "Murdered children are no longer news. International media coverage of the war in Afghanistan, where child deaths reached an all-time high last year, is sporadic at best. In Yemen, it's estimated that at least 85,000 under 5s have died of starvation since 2015, a figure that numbs the mind. In Syria, especially, it is hard to keep count because children are being killed almost every day, and who's really counting?" These are just 2 articles sampled from the last several days of news, and maybe not even the most important, however that's measured. Sitting here by the rivers of Babylon, do we even remember Zion? I've been struggling hard, and I'm sorry to report, very ineffectually. Ken's kind and unceasing ministry to me notwithstanding, to come to terms with this state of affairs. But then again, even Solomon wasn't up to the task. And so on this beautiful morning, as we're gathered in this glorious sanctuary, it seems to me fitting that we hear these despondent words and acknowledge our horror and dismay as we prepare to share in celebrating communion together. My father hates the filler on the roof. He describes it this way: in the span of a few short hours, through no fault of his own, a perfectly good man loses his home and 3 daughters. People call this entertainment? In one of the high points of the musical, just before suffering a vicious attack, our righteous and fallible protagonist, Tevye, sings, "God would like us to be joyful, even though our hearts lie panting on the floor. How much more can we be joyful when there's really something to be joyful for?" How is such joy even possible? Hearkening back to the exiles in Babylon, Lucille Clifton celebrates the mere miracle of surviving in her poem, "Won't You Celebrate With Me?" Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman, what did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. Nowhere does Ms. Clifton minimize the loneliness, doubt, or suffering she's experienced. Rather, she names them outright as the condition, the context, the justification for celebration. After all, like the prodigal son, rescued lamb, or found coin of the parables, celebration is in order for that which has been deemed hopeless or lost. How often are we deemed, including sometimes by ourselves, to be hopeless or lost? God tells us that we are beloved, created of God's love, and God rejoices over our becoming our true selves as our souls traverse this bridge between starshine and clay. We, along with the rest of creation, are blessings encoded in matter. If God rejoices in us and through us, who are we to choose despair over celebration? And yet I'm awed by Ms. Clifton's choice, which too often seems far beyond my reach. Stepping beyond our own individualities, William Stafford names as miracles the innumerable, tiny yet immortal and sacred embodiments of grace in a single morning. Today, the ordinary miracles begin. Somewhere a signal arrives. Now. And the rays come down. A tomorrow has come. Open your hands, lift them. Morning rings all the doorbells. Porches are cells for prayer. Religion has touched your throat. Not the same now. You could close your eyes and go on, full of light. And it is already begun, the chord that will shiver glass, the song full of time bending above us. Outside a sign, a bird intervenes. The wings tell the air, be warm. No one is out there, but a giant has passed through town, widening streets, touching the ground, shouldering away the stars. This might be the best and most illuminating oxymoron I've ever encountered. What do we make of an ordinary miracle? How do we begin to recognize that all that is suffused with the divine? Even as we well-educated, well-informed, highly rational, and spiritually reserved mainline Protestants struggle to reconcile our balking minds to the notion of miracles, we long for indisputable proofs of God's grace in action, the healing of untreatable conditions, the peaceable dispersal of a crowd bent on violence, the appearance of angels. Or as Stephen Erickson postulated in his novel Rejoice, A Knife to the Heart, an inescapable, irresistible, utterly implacable intervention to force us to stop destroying each other and our increasingly battered ecosystem. If I could choose a miracle to order, that would be it. For God to force us to know peace. I keep praying for that every day, even though the miracle we celebrate this morning is of a completely different order. God choosing not to compel us in any way, but rather to step into our human condition and voluntarily experience the worst it has to offer. Rather than cursing our darkness, and yet without excusing or minimizing it either, God invites us instead to develop dark, adapted eyes, to acknowledge the darkness, but not surrender to it, to see through the gloom, to recognize and celebrate what is holy, what is life-giving, what is miraculous within and around us. Ms. Clifton's call to celebration echoes John chapter 1, verse 5. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Or as the Maasai Creed tells the story, he was rejected by his people, tortured, and nailed hands and feet to a cross, and died. He was buried in the grave, but the hyenas did not touch him. And on the third day he rose from the grave. He ascended to the skies. He is the Lord. Ordinary miracles might confound the mind, but this is truly too huge for human comprehension. Yes, the world is indisputably, literally on fire. We are exiles and captives, and sometimes we are also the tormentors, intentionally or unwittingly fanning the flames, manufacturing misery. Sometimes we are the lynch mob, and sometimes we are the hyenas, and sometimes we are the dead. All that was also true and had been true for millennia when Christ declined to extinguish the fire or banish the darkness, and instead offered himself up to be reviled, tortured, and killed for our sake, without caveat, exception, or qualifying conditions. Along with the disciples, we're horrified and dismayed. Along with Solomon, we despair. Along with the exiles in Babylon, we grieve. Along with the enslaved, imprisoned, vilified, persecuted, excluded, oppressed, deprived, abused, and slaughtered among and around us, and indeed along with God, we weep. And yet, that is not the last word. Christ was not consumed or destroyed, but rather transformed. And God promises that we are also transformed, being transformed, to be transformed. I confess I have no idea whatsoever what that means in any tense. But I think it starts with the Lord's Prayer. God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That prayer involves us in practicing and passing along God's celebration. It charges us with doing as God does, sharing our privilege without reservation, preferentially caring for those who are despised and discarded, seeing and responding to suffering, and recognizing and celebrating innumerable miracles of every magnitude. Rosemary Watola Trommer's poem, "Would You Know a Miracle If You Saw One?" invites us to witness all manner of miracles. The parking space beside the store when you were late. The man who showed up just in time to hold the door when you were juggling 5 big packages. The spider plant that grew, though you forgot to water it. The new nest in the tree outside your window. Chime of distant church bells when you're lonely. Rhyme of friendship. Apples. Sky a trove of blue. And who's to say these miracles are less significant than burning bushes, loaves and fishes, steps on water? We are blessed by marvels wearing ordinary clothes. How easily we're fooled by simple dress. Oranges, water, leaves, bread, crows. To Ms. Trommer's list of marvels, I would add many things, and more than things, the animals who have blessed my life. But I would especially acknowledge miracles in the form of people. Greta Thunberg, Nadia Murad, the Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh, Rohan Gunatilake, Reverends William Barber and Liz Theo Harris, Sister Wendy, Brother David Steindl-Rast, Karen Paris, Milton Brasher Cunningham, all of you, and many others besides. Do I recognize miracles when I see them? Most of the time, probably not, especially when the background of brutality and degradation is so monumental that it fully fills my field of view, which it more and more often does. And maybe this meditation is more for me than it is for you, in which case I sincerely ask your forgiveness and forbearance. But I think we are called to develop dark-adapted eyes. We are called to practice celebrating miracles, especially when they defy human wisdom, and perhaps most of all when they seem hopeless or insignificant. Here this morning in this sanctuary, we have a near infinite abundance of miracles to choose from. And here at this sacred table, we have the most profound and everlasting cause to celebrate. So let us attest that the darkness within us and around us is vast and terrible and deep. It has been here since long before we were born, and it is not going away anytime soon. Let us confess that sometimes we ourselves perpetuate the darkness, and let us be swift to act on God's loving correction to be instead bearers of divine light. Let us pray, and let us be the prayer that God's light be undimmed here in the dark, on earth, in Babylon, in the United States of America, in this church, in our souls. As God has promised us, it is, and always has been, and ever will be. As we testify to the mystifying truth of that seeming impossibility, even if we must sing through tears, let us sing songs of joy. Amen.